Hello and welcome. How do you feel about marrying a robot? Actually marrying and consummating the marriage, I should point out. It may sound far-fetched, but there are those who believe it's really not that long before this will happen. Think about it. Millions of dollars are being invested by some of the world's largest companies to create machines that are more and more human-like in appearance and that do more than just build cars or vacuum floors. In fact, we're already in an age where robots are capable of all kinds of things that, up until a few years ago, we thought were only human behaviors. Like walking, running, playing musical instruments, cuddling, and even providing companionship.
朝起きた時は「パロちゃんおはよう」って言うんですよね。だって冷蔵庫に言えないもんね、おはようなんてね。ね、一人やからね。
It's a fascinating and often daunting subject, and we want your input. Don't forget, we take your calls on this show. You can reach us at the numbers at the bottom of your screen. The man who got us thinking about these issues is our guest today. Author Dr. David Levy joins me now from our studios in London. An internationally recognized expert on artificial intelligence, he first made his name as a master chess player who even played against the world's leading chess computers. Since then, he's written extensively on intimate relationships with robotic partners and is author of Love and Sex with Robots, The Evolution of the Human-Robot Relationship, a book looking closely at how that human-robot intimacy is likely to develop. Dr. Levy, welcome to the show.
Thank you and good evening.
Good to have you with us. And I have to start by asking you, I think one thing that surprises a lot of people about your book is not so much the idea that humans will have sex with robots, but it's the idea they will actually fall in love with them. And I wonder what basic premise you found that on.
Well, I looked at a lot of the psychology literature, investigations into why humans fall in love, and I noticed that a lot of the main reasons seem to me to be paralleled in the way that robots are being developed and that they will develop in the future. I think that the causes are very similar, and so I think it's quite likely that humans will start falling in love with robots probably in about 30 or 40 years from now, when the robots are sophisticated, have personalities, have sophisticated emotions, and can carry on conversations at a human-like level.
It's interesting because in your book you write, now just a quick quote from this, is the robots of the mid-21st century will also possess human-like or superhuman-like consciousness and emotions. Now, is it that they will have emotions or just simply display emotions? Because there's a difference.
Yes, you're quite right. They will have artificial emotions, but they won't be real in the sense that we understand them. On the other hand, they'll display the emotions in such a convincing manner that we won't be able to tell the difference. So it'll be just as good as having a relationship with a human from that point of view. Which
is difficult at the best of times. But I have to put an email question that we got about the issue of relationships with robots from Barb Sonia from Springfield here in the USA. And she writes, sex and companionship are two different things. The aging and elderly population of the world does suffer from the lack of both sex and companionship in many ways. But what is acceptable for one society may not be acceptable for another. And I wonder to what extent you see that idea that, you know, certain sort of ethics and moral values might really cloud the matter down the road.
Yes, I think that's definitely a possibility. For example, in Japan, they're far more receptive to robots than the peoples of most other countries. And I think that in general, Japan and the United States are going to lead the way in the field of advanced robots used for companionship, friendship, love, sex, and very sophisticated type relationships. I think in some countries and some cultures, particularly perhaps some of the Catholic countries, might be more opposed to the idea of marriage and sex with robots.
Yeah, actually, when you say that, I mean, is there any need to marry a robot as such? What would be the reason to have what is effectively a religiously sort of covered relationship with a robot?
Well, one could ask the same question about human marriage. I mean, is there really any need to marry a human? Nowadays, there are so many partnerships out of wedlock that it doesn't seem necessary at all. I think it's really just a question of personal taste.
There's an interesting email that came from Mohammed in London who puts a humorous angle on it. He says, as a Muslim, can I have 4 robot wives? Now, it may seem silly, but I have to ask you, what is the likely scenario when it comes to having more than one robot partner? Because if they display emotions as such, jealousy is also an emotion.
I think the key to remember is that the robot's actions and performance are entirely software driven, and if one programs a robot to become accustomed to the idea of being one of 4 wives, then the robot will be quite content and will exhibit perfect contentment and there's no reason why your listener shouldn't have 4 wives if he wants to.
I would hate to see the divorce proceedings, but I have to ask you. You mentioned that you looked into certain factors when it came to to writing the book, when you looked at human psychology and so on. What in particular, what parameters were you looking at? Both from the side of robotic development and from the side of how humans react to developing emotions for inanimate objects.
Well, humans develop emotions for inanimate objects from a very early age. Children, babies, develop emotional attachments to their blankets, to their teddy bears, and so on. So this is a well-known phenomenon that's been studied for a number of years. The kind of parallels I was talking about earlier, perhaps I should give you 1 or 2 examples. One of the reasons why we humans tend to fall in love is because of similarities between ourselves and the person we're falling in love with. So if, for example, we meet someone who has the same hobbies and interests as ourselves, or the same political ideas, the same kind of moral code, the same kind of ethics, perhaps the same religious or family background, it makes it more likely that we're going to fall in love with them. That's just one example. Now, with a robot, of course, you can program it to appear to have any kind of personality that you wish, any kind of background knowledge that you wish, and so it will be relatively easy in the future, when robots have huge memories, to program them to be just like human beings with various personalities and knowledge bases.
I'm going to show our viewers a clip because there is some degree of companionship already offered by robotic pets, and I want to show our viewers a clip of Paro, which is a robotic seal that's becoming popular with the elderly in Japan.
パロって言うたらこっち向いてくれる、いいはっていう発声する、好き、嬉しいっていう声を出す、そういったらやっぱりね、和みますね、癒されますね、自分が。ね、そうね、今そうなのよ。これ嫌っていうのよね。いや、まあ分かった分かった分かった。
Is it, from Dr. Levy, is there anything that you know from that documents the sort of physiological and psychological improvement in patients who have even a robotic pet like this? Is there anything documenting that?
Yes, there is. I discuss it in the book. Psychologists have found that patients, particularly elderly people, their general feeling, their happiness, level of happiness improves when they are given robotic pets. And the Japanese government is actually investing huge amounts of money into the development of robots to be used to take care of the elderly. The Japanese are extremely worried because their elderly population is increasing steadily as a percentage of the overall population, and there are enormous social problems on the horizon if some way isn't found to take care of the elderly more than they can do at the moment. The US government is also looking at this, and there's research going on in the States as well at some universities. But it's Japan, I think, that's leading the way, and that's why the seal, for example, was developed in Japan and appears to be quite successful.
In fact, we have another clip of Paro here, which talks about a couple who no longer were able to keep pets because as they got older it was harder to care for them. Here's another clip of Paro.
というよりも家族ですかね。ほとんど家族で。ロボットと思ったらあんまり相手もできないと思うし。
It's interesting. The seal has a pacifier, a dummy, as a charger, so it actually makes it look even that much more cuter. And I have to ask you though, when it comes to having something like a pet, for a lot of people, there's the experience with a live pet of seeing it grow from a kitten or a puppy or whatever into an adult state, and then even to some degree the maturing of the pet with aging. Now, with a robot, of course, it could be programmed, but physically, it's going to still look the same, isn't it?
Well, one would think so at the moment, but one doesn't know what kind of technologies for the physical development of robots might be possible in the future to actually give them the appearance of growing physically as well as emotionally and intellectually.
I've got a caller on the line from London. Anwar, your question for Dr. Levy, please.
Oh, hi, good evening, guys.
Hi.
I just want to ask him, when you have a relationship with an animal or with a human being, there is a soul involved. How are you going to create soul in a robot?
Okay.
Well, there are researchers currently working on the development of what's called artificial consciousness, which I think is very much what you're talking about. This is a field that's relatively new. It's only really in the last 4 or 5 years that there's been a lot of effort put into this subject, but already there are 3 books on the subject of robot consciousness or artificial consciousness, and I think this is something that will happen. It will be an artificial form of consciousness, but as I said earlier, if it appears to be the real thing, then in effect it's as good as the real thing. What's important is that it's convincing.
There's an email that came in on the subject of the Japanese. Now I know that they've been moving very aggressively in this field, as you mentioned. This Sally from Texas, actually, in the US, says robots became popular in Japan because of animistic tendencies brought on by Eastern religions. So I don't think that they will have the same success in Europe. What's your view on that?
I understand what she's saying, and certainly the animistic tendencies have had a big bearing on the rapidity with which the Japanese have taken to robots. On the other hand, nowadays everyone knows about robots, and the development of the type of robot I write about in my book is going to happen not overnight. It's something that's going to happen over years and decades, and people will become accustomed to it, and as they become accustomed to it, so I think they'll become curious about what the robots are going to be able to do, and that will make a lot of people attracted to the idea, so that when these robots are actually ready and available and on the market for sale or for hire, I think a lot of people will already be eager to try them out.
Well, interestingly enough, we've touched on the fact that Japan has major issues with an aging population and diminishing young population, which obviously is going to have an impact not just on the sort of having an elderly population to care for, but the fact the labor force is diminishing. And this email that came in from April in the Philippines touches on that. April says, to what extent do you think that robots will become a rational alternative to opening up borders to immigration, especially in societies that have issues with shrinking and aging populations like Japan?
I'm sorry, I didn't really understand the question about the borders.
I guess the idea that instead of opening up borders to immigrants, there is the option with more advanced robots to actually creating a workforce without having to import it, so to speak. And I wonder what April is saying is, to what extent do you think this would be a rational alternative to immigrants?
Well, if that was the only reason for opening the borders to immigrants, then one could argue that robots might be a better alternative. But I don't see robots as being just workers or slaves. Far from it. I see one of the greatest benefits from robots will be the social benefits that we have by introducing many more entities into the world that are friendly and that like us and that behave in ways so that we enjoy their company. And so I think opening up the borders will really be something that will be done because we want robots as our friends, our companions, our lovers. I don't think it's just going to be a master-slave relationship. There are people who disagree with me, but I think the main purpose of robots in the future, humanoid robots, is going to be as our companions, friends and lovers.
Now it's interesting, you and I, when we had a chat before the show, you were saying that you're not really a science fiction buff as such, and in fact wanted to make sure you stayed away from anything science fiction in this book because you want to concentrate on the hard facts and how this is a serious subject that is taking a certain line of development. Now I wonder though, to what extent people's expectations have really grown because of watching science fiction movies and like iRobot and so on, and to what extent that will shape perhaps how we as society develop those robots to work for us.
I think that will definitely have an effect. There's no doubt at all that people's expectations have been affected by science fiction literature and films, and to some extent, of course, when people see a robot able to perform some amazing task, they'll want to see that in a real robot in the future. But as I mentioned to you earlier, I really want my work to be treated in the way that it is, as serious scientific research. And I just felt when writing the book that if I'd alluded to science fiction too much, people might have thought I was just really writing an extension of science fiction and not taking my work seriously.
One thing though that science fiction, or at least Hollywood's interpretation of some of the developments that might happen, what it does do is it raises the issue of some of the issues that might come up, and one of them is that even though you can program robots, as they develop emotions or intelligence, sort of active intelligence, they could also to some degree rebel. They could take a different line from that programming. To what extent do you think that's possible?
I think it's possible, and I think it's a very serious fear. And of course, in the science fiction literature, there are countless stories of robots that effectively took over. And this is something we have to be very careful about in the future. We've seen what a terrible effect hackers, computer hackers, can have, all the damage they can do by hacking into secure computer systems and into people's email. And I think in the future we have to be very careful that unscrupulous people don't start causing havoc by modifying the software and the memories of robots. There'll have to be special laws to take care of it, and there'll have to be measures taken to guard against it. I don't know what the answers are, but I do raise these questions in the book.
Right. And you know, one interesting angle a viewer took on the development of robots came in an email from Sabah in Eritrea. And Sabah wrote in saying, in Japan, robots are a product of popular culture, so science fiction inspired real science. In the US, we see any advance or breakthrough being made in robotic technology is from the military. Does this result from the very pugnacious culture of the West?
One could say so in a way. I mean, it's certainly true that much of the artificial intelligence and robotics research in the US is funded by the US government, by various defense departments. This is simply because the defense departments want to be able to use robots for military purposes, and so they're willing to plough massive amounts of research money into universities and research institutes in order to develop robots, even though a lot of the development work is not being done for military purposes. This is simply a fact of life, and there are some robotics experts who in fact refuse to accept military funding. But the majority of people working in this field do accept military funding, right, partly because it's a big source of funding, and partly because they're not themselves working on products that have military bearing.
I have to ask you, just with 30 seconds to go, Dr. Levy, you yourself as a master chess player played against some of the top computer chess programs, and I wondered to what extent they developed any kind of human characteristics to which you latched onto. What was your relationship with those computers?
Well, certainly the programs I played, each of them had its own personality, and I tried wherever possible to take advantage of faults in their personalities. I was able to do it for quite a while, but then eventually they got too strong for me.
Well, we thank you very much. A fascinating book, sir, and thank you very much for joining us to talk about it.
You're welcome.
And thank you for being with us. On the next show, we look at the horrors of human trafficking through the eyes of one woman who experienced it firsthand. Don't forget, if you have any thoughts about that or other pressing issues around the world, you send your emails to riz@aljazeera.net. We'll see you next time. Street Talk is next.